you so much. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about research that has been happening since about the early 2000s. There's a lot of different groups of people that have contributed. The NGO Oikonos, the state of Hawaii, USGS, and I am at HPU. So I'm going to start with a little mystery event that happened on July 29, 2000. We are off the Central California coast. It's a foggy, calm day. You know, we're out there in the ocean, and all of a sudden, at about 2:30 in the afternoon, somebody on the boat calls out, "Albatross, Albatross!" And you run over there, you get your binos up, and you're trying to find this thing, and there's this albatross flying by, and you know, there's some white, there's some gray on the face. And so let me read to you the account of this day from the person who reported this, Mark. He says, "Sure enough, the bird came down the starboard side, and I picked it up pretty quickly. I got on the bird, and I saw that the wing linings were essentially pure white. I then panned over to the head of the bird and saw the gray bill and thought, oh my God." Dun, dun, dun. This bird, according to all known information, all published information, should not have been where it was seen. This is a much better picture of it. Eventually, the bird came over, sat down next to the boat. A lot of pictures were taken. Usually in ecology, in biology, we use the term range. The range is the place, the area, geographic area where species occur. And, you know, usually we like to depict them using this sort of blobs. So orange is the places in the ocean where this particular type of albatross, the Salvin's albatross, likes to hang out. Of course, this is an oversimplification because it looks all the same color, homogeneously orange. And in reality, there are some areas that are used more, or there's more birds seen on those areas. These are often called core areas. So for this particular species, the core is between Australia and South America going up the Peru Current. So this area is where the populations occur in different islands around Australia, and they disperse this way. But sometimes there's occasional sightings all the way to South Africa, and they dip into the subantarctic waters. So this is, you know, in theory where these birds are. But when you go out in the ocean, unexpected things can happen. You can find species that are not where they're supposed to be. We call these events extraliminal, which means you are outside of the limits of that polygon that we have over the years and decades developed. This bird, right, just to highlight, this bird was up over here, which is very, very, very far from where it's supposed to be. So, you know, the way ornithology moves forward, and especially marine ornithology, is, you know, people go out in the ocean. Traditionally, they would observe species. Sometimes they would, you know, long time ago, they would actually shoot some of the birds to make sure they knew what they were. And eventually, you know, we start building lists of where we see different things, how many, and so forth. So then if you go in the literature and you look, where have Salvin or shy albatrosses, where have they been seen? You start getting a sense, you know, this is a paper from 2005 that lists. So here we have the one bird that was seen, the one that I told you about, and it was seen repeatedly, you know, between July 29 and 10 September. So it was hanging out of Cordell Bank. Then maybe this is the same bird that was seen later on in September again. This is one of these birds seen on Midway Atoll. Some of you have been there. So one of these albatrosses showed up in Midway. And this is a later record where this paper comes from. It's been also seen of the Aleutians in Alaska. You know, different sightings, different times of the year, different subspecies or of the same type of albatross. So eventually, you know, you start building these records, and then the obvious questions come about. Well, the first one is, why did the albatross cross the ocean? Why did it show up over there? You know, does it have a bad genetic point mutation in the map? And, you know, it's thinking it's going south, but it's going north? Or is there just curiosity? You know, at some times, especially juvenile birds often are seen doing these crazy migrations. This crazy is called vagrancy. They're vagrants. They are in the wrong place. They don't have to work, really. They don't have to make babies. So they spend maybe 4, 6, 10 years in the ocean. And during these times, they can go really far and show up in very weird places. Eventually, as more of these sightings are compiled, maybe things that are really rare become more uncommon, and then from uncommon, maybe they become common, and then from common, they become standard, and then eventually the range gets moved to encompass that new area.
Could I ask a quick question? I'm
Yes.
confused. Are we talking on sightings on shy albatross only?
Yes, right now
Because
just...
I can't tell the difference between one and the other.
Yes, that's right. They're really hard to tell, and that's part of the big problem with this kind of the traditional way of doing this work, right? Where, again, people from ships observing, often just seeing things. Now at least we can take digital photos, these kinds of things. We can get better IDs, but traditionally it was, compiling records over time and trying to see how distributions may change over seasons, over years, over time, And again, in many places of the world, things that used to be really rare now are more commonplace. Like Hawaiian petrels are now seen off California fairly frequently in summer. So then you start thinking, well, maybe climate change, those kinds of things. But again, a very long-term, tedious process of compiling the information. This is the old way of doing things. Also, if you think about it, you see these birds, you see a bird like this, and well, we really don't have any information to interpret this sighting. We know it's an adult bird, but we don't know where island does it come from. We don't know, did it just breed last year, or is it on holiday, not breeding, skipping breeding? It's very hard to really interpret. So I want you to think of how could we study these birds in ways that would allow us to have more information once we see them in the ocean, where we see where they go. It'd be really great if we could figure out, this bird comes from this island or that island, or this bird we know has a chick right now in a colony and it's in the ocean looking for food back for the baby, or it's taking a holiday, those kinds of things, right? That's really, really essential. So in today's talk, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about the focal species of today's talk, which is the black-footed albatross. Then a little background of what we know about black-footed albatrosses. I'm going to tell you briefly about the same kind of information that we have from at-sea surveys, then other improved ways, maybe using bands. I have some bands on the table so you can see the kinds of bands that they're fitted with. Some bands are just to show you who's the individual. Other bands have colors, and you can tell the island that the bird comes from, for example. When you see it at sea, you know that's from Turn Island or that's from Midway. Then I'm going to move on to tracking, which is where we can actually follow individuals in a much more detailed fashion. We get very nice movements of where they go and where they spend their time. I'm going to give you 2 case studies, one looking at where birds go when they're free from breeding. So this is their post-breeding, or sort of the little holiday season for them. And the other one is when they actually have young chicks on a colony and they have to go to the supermarket and come back with food for their chicks. And then some conclusions. And again, on the table later, you can check out some of the tags we've used in the past. You can see the very old ones and the more new ones. Okay, so this is our focal species, the black-footed albatross. Basically, what we're trying to figure out with all of this research is, where do they go to feed? What threats do they face in those areas of the ocean that they visit by overlapping their movements with other layers like fishing, plastic, those kinds of things. And ultimately, who bears responsibility for their conservation? Because different parts of the ocean are under different countries' jurisdictions, under different international agreements. So we also want to not only pinpoint possible problems, but figure out who would have to respond or address these issues. Okay, so this is some background on black-footed albatross distribution. So these are range maps. And, an obvious thing you often see when you compare species distribution is that they're not static. They move, they shift seasonally. This is summer and this is winter. This picture is a little more sophisticated because it shows you different levels of shading. Black means this is really the core. This is where you see a lot of black-footed albatrosses. This gray is a sort of an intermediate place where the densities are not so abundant, and the really light hatching is the range, but again, where you see very few of them. These data come to a great extent from different surveys. A lot of people from the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s collecting data at sea, and some banding records. Okay, so again, there's a shift between summer and winter. In summer, it looks like they move to the north and they move further to the west. I really want to spend just a little more time to show you the next sort of layer of how people have studied seasonal movements, migrations of these far-ranging seabirds before tracking really got going. This was done with banding, where again, birds are fitted with metal unique ID bands, and then you have a starting time and point. The bird is recovered. In this case, from fisheries. Birds are incidentally killed in fisheries, and then that unique number can be traced back to the place and the time where the bird was tagged. So you basically have a line from the starting island where it was tagged to the ending point where the bird was killed in the fishery. Okay? And these points can be separated by a few months or many years. So in this particular study, they took all these banding records and they wanted to map the average location and the standard deviation, which depicts how variable the values are about that average for different months. And you know, it really does make sense. Let me show you. So here we have November to February. They're fairly close to the islands in the south of the North Pacific. What happens between November and February in terms of the life of the black-footed albatross? Do you guys know? Why would the birds be close to the islands at this time of the year?
They're breeding.
They're breeding, right? Yes, so this is the incubation and the early period of the chicks. The chicks are born, any guesses when they're born? They're all Capricorn. About January, middle of January. Okay, so the parents go on very short voyages, feed the babies. Then March through June, they start going on these much longer voyages. They start coming to the west coast of the U.S. Now upwelling, productivity is really picking up in spring and early summer in the west coast. They start going on these big voyages. And then towards the end of June, the season is over for breeding. The chicks are fledging, and now the birds move way north. Again, taking advantage of the more productive environment in the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutians. And again, they don't have to go back to the islands. You see, their circle is very far from the islands. They really don't come back. They're out there. And then, you know, about November, they come back to the islands. So this is sort of this loop that we get from banding. Again, an average picture over many years, many birds. So in about the late 1990s, early 2000s, new technology was available to biologists to track individual movements of animals. This technology is called Argos, the Argos system, and it's based on the NOAA weather satellites. Basically, the way this goes is we attach a device, a transmitter. You see here a little transmitter attached with tape. I have some example of the tape there, so you see how that works. Here's the antenna. This little black-footed albatross is going to be let go. The weight of this device is 54 grams, about 10 quarters. And the rules are we cannot deploy tags that are equal or heavier than 3% of the mass of the bird. Okay, these birds are about 2 to 3 kilos in mass. So 54-gram tag with tape, the bird goes off, the tags eventually fall off, the tape, you know, becomes wet in the sun, it breaks down. 60 to 90 days, we can track the movements of these individual birds. So using some of these methods in the late 1990s, there was a lot of work done in Turn Island here, depicted by the star, and some of those long voyages were really very carefully characterized. So you see this is a typical trip. The bird went 4,400 kilometers away from the nest. It traveled 12,000 kilometers. It left Turn Island. It came over to the west coast, Central California, Cordell Bank. was hanging out, went up the coast, went to Oregon and Washington. He went a little bit into Canada, because you see here there's a blue line, so this is the economic exclusive zone of Canada, and then he came back home. The trip took about 22 days, and you know, when you look at these loops back and back and back, all these birds are doing these voyages. They're coming to the West Coast, foraging, and coming back home to feed their chicks. And we really got the sense that they really like this shallow 200 to 2,000 meter areas called the shelf break and the slope, where a lot of fishing, a lot of productivity is happening. You know, this is a really nice picture here. You see, this is a black-throated albatross with a tag flying by after we tagged it in the ocean, just so you get a sense of the scale. So our goal at the time was, well, we seem to have found where's the restaurant. So let's go to the restaurant. Let's tag the birds when they don't have to come back home in July, August, and let's see what they do. This is Cordell Bank. You see, this is the shelf break where the bathymetry really drops off. This is Cordell Bank, that seamount that a lot of albatrosses are visiting. And this is the Gulf of the Farallones, very close to San Francisco and Bodega Point. Okay, so our objective was, again, to figure out where do albatrosses go when they are not constrained to have to go back to the island, right? This is their holiday. And we thought, well, you know, based on previous data from ships, we think they're going to stay in this area. Maybe they're going to leapfrog to other seamounts, Hacketa Bank in Oregon. There's some other places of Washington. Maybe make their way up north following the seasonal changes in the productivity and then go back to Hawaii. So we wanted to figure out also, do they concentrate in specific areas? Do they leave these sanctuaries and move into unprotected waters where long lining can happen? Also, do males and females go different ways? Because if the fishery is preferentially killing males or females, it can have very different effects on the population. Okay, so this was the first bird we tagged. Here you see the little antenna sticking out. We called this bird Francisca. And, you know, we put the little tag on and we said, okay, let's go, you know. We have our idea of what you're going to do. And we got a huge surprise. Big surprise. So these points show you the different locations that the bird gave us via the satellite. The bar here, it's going to be shown repeatedly in other maps later. This is days that the bird's being tracked. So you see it starts at 50, at 0, sorry, way here. This is the beginning, and it goes to like 56. So this bird traveled 17,000 kilometers, on average 330, which is about 200 miles per day. It took off. It left the sanctuary. It left the U.S. waters. It went around this high-pressure system, came back, looked around, came close to the Aleutians, and then almost went across the international date line and spent the rest of the time we tracked it over here. It ranged from tropical waters down here all the way to subarctic waters, 12 degrees, so really ventured over a vast range of kind of oceanographic conditions. And it only spent 15% of its time in the United States waters. It spent 85% of the time in the open ocean. And some of this U.S. water time is brought in here by visiting the Aleutians. It was in California, EEZ, international waters, Alaska, EEZ, and then the high seas. So again, you know, this was the first bird, and we got a big surprise where, again, you know, the ranges give you this average picture, but when you follow individuals, they seem to have a personality. Mm-hmm. They do things in different ways. This is now a summary of the birds we tagged over 2 years, 2004, 2005. You see they're color-coded. And it shows you where they went. And you see a bunch of lines coming all the way to Japan and entering Russian EEZ. A lot of moving around this area because all the birds were tagged right there at the star. So we can ascribe or assign the time the birds spent to different national jurisdictions. So here you see males and females, the two colors, and there's 2 bars for each because we have 2 years. And there was no significant differences. So basically, they're spending about 60% of the time in waters that don't belong to any country. only about 40% of the time in the US, and some of the birds they visited Japan, Russia, Canada, and Mexico. So they're going into other countries' waters. Again, our prediction was they should stay in this really productive part of California and make their way up the coast, visiting other similar seamounts. We were wrong, which was really cool. You know, discovery is really fun in science when you're proven wrong. It's really nice. So this is now, I want you guys to get used to this. This is taking all those data and breaking it down, combining them into time. The hotter the color, this means the higher amount of time, and less hot colors. Blue means a lot less time. So it's a way to, again, to try to convert our tracking data into those range maps, right? Showing those hot areas. And again, you know, Cordell Bank shows up hot because this is where we tag the bird. So this is a bit of a bias because that's where we start. But you really get a sense that they're filling in space, you know, really, really widely. And we have females on the top and males on the bottom. So what happens when they go over to the Western Pacific? Well, we were concerned because we had been compiling data from the Coast Guard. These are sightings and apprehensions of illegal, unregulated fishing boats, drift nets, that were supposed to be banned in the early 1990s. All these points are those records. There's this box here that depicts where this illegal fishing is happening, and our albatrosses are, you know, the albatrosses that we are responsible for as a country are leaving our waters and going through that area. Also, we know when you take a long line fishing effort, this is the amount of hooks that are deployed. These are big boxes, about 500 kilometers on the side, by 500 kilometers on the side. You look at the average over the last decade and the few years before the tracking happened. Basically, on summer of these years, about 11 billion with a B hooks were deployed over this 13 years in the Pacific Ocean. So these are huge amounts. So these are 2 to 3%. This is 2 to 3 million hooks in any one of these boxes. And again, the birds come over here. They're not entering the area north of Hawaii where a lot of the long line is happening, but they're going into the Western Pacific where some great amount of long lining is happening. So again, we can take tracking data and superimpose it with possible threats, and then we can communicate to the proper national jurisdictions or international agencies. In this case, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community Fisheries Program, which is an international organization. We can tell them, well, you should be aware because these birds are going into your fishing zones, and in this particular place, this is where we see that happening. So the findings then for this post-breeding season, we know they spend 60% of the time in no man's land out there, about 40% of the time in the U.S. waters, even though all of these birds were tagged inside of U.S. sanctuaries, right, where they were protected. And then everybody left. They left the sanctuaries and they left U.S. waters. Once they're in the U.S. waters, they're spending about 40% of the time within the National Marine Sanctuary. So that's good news. The sanctuaries are placed really to encompass important albatross areas. The problem is they leave them. Also, we saw some differences in the sexes, just to show you that the latitude was not different, but the longitude was different. The males are going further west. In particular, males are the ones that are really going all the way across to Japan, and the females are not venturing that far. Okay, so this gives you a little taste of, this post-breeding big migratory movements. Now I want to bring you back home. I want to bring you to the to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and I want to tell you about similar work we did later with improved technology to map now the movements of parents that have chicks on the nest. So this is a black-footed albatross chick sitting there, and this is a bolus that they regurgitate, a big pellet of squid beaks and other undigestible material and a lot of plastic. Our goal was to understand where do these parents forage and therefore collect this plastic that we're finding on the chicks. So this is the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, the monument. This is Kure, where the tracking that I'm going to tell you about took place. But I'm also very briefly going to tell you some data on the plastic that the chicks are ingesting from Tern and Midway. because this evidence of the high levels of plastic ingestion is really what motivated our research. We wanted to understand where are they collecting this material. So this is a pretty complex graph. The main thing I want you guys to get at right now, focus on the black bars or gray bars. That's black-footed albatrosses. You see there's two panels. The top panel says the mass of the bolus, so how many grams the bolus was, the weight of the bolus, and the bottom is the percent of the bolus that was plastic. Then you see here you have K for Cure, M for midway, T for turn. So Cure has the biggest boluses, on average about 40 grams, but they can go up to almost 80 grams. But most impressive than that is the amount of plastic that they have. They have about 70% to 75% plastic by mass. So basically, Cure et al. Has the largest boluses and the highest amount of plastic percent-wise. And I have, there's statistics that demonstrate that if you analyze these data. So Cure is really the place where we thought we got to go there and see where these birds are getting their plastic. Where are they going? We knew from turn those birds were coming to the West Coast, right? Remember that first picture I showed you? And we thought, the West Coast is so far. Well, maybe they're going to the Japan continental shelf. They like continental shelves. How California is just way too far. Maybe they're coming over to the west and they're going into that area. Let's see. That again was our prediction. Well, in 2008, we did some preliminary tracking using the same technology, the old Argos tags, and this shows you this is Cure here. All these points are color-coded by bird, and then here I do the same exercise where I convert them into the amount of time. So you see there's a lot of time spent around the island because the birds are coming and going and spending some time with very short trips. But there's a little hotspot over here, another area of high use, further to the west. Nobody was going to Japan. They were foraging in the open ocean, targeting some seamounts in the Emperor Seamount chain. A lot of numbers. The main thing I want to show you, I just want you to get a feeling for how many days were the trips. Well, it really varied. Some were 1 day, some were 10 days. This is the linear distance from the colony that they went. Some stayed really close, 100 kilometers, 150. Some went further away. And this is the total distance that they traveled. And these are the averages. So on average, fairly short 5-day trips, traveling about 500 kilometers away. And when you look at some of the information, you can say, well, does the duration of the voyage influence how far they go? Yes, it does, very, very strongly. The longer the voyage, the more time they spend away. And it seems like there's short voyages and then long voyages. They kind of do this alternation. And then this is the total distance traveled versus the duration. Again, a very nice relationship. So it really suggests that these birds are not really just going to the market and coming home, because then there would be really no variability. Everybody would be doing the same thing if they were all going to the same market. If you do this for the birds in California, there's very little variation because they all come to Cordoba and can come home. These looks more like a always searching behavior. Because if you find food and you fill up, you go home. Shorter voyage, you didn't go very far. If you don't, you keep searching. You keep looping around until you find it. It takes you longer, you travel more. So this looks like a different kind of a searching behavior from the West Coast. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the birds do not go to the California continental shelf, but they don't go to the Japanese continental shelf either. They forage in the open ocean, over deep water and over seamounts, which are submarine mountains. We have another analysis we did for the monument showing that really seamounts were targeted and were very, very high use, given how little they account for the ocean area. Again, all the birds left the U.S. waters. None entered another country, though. They were just spending their time in the open ocean. And they spent about 52% of their time in the United States. But still, every bird went outside into areas where fisheries regulations, are an international affair. Okay, so now let me show you a little bit what happened when some of these birds, when we left the tags on and we mapped their migration, because really we were after the migration part, but we got a few loops. So you see here's one bird. Every bird has a different name. Kaupu did a loop, a big loop, a little loop, and then it said, okay, chick, I'm done. And it took off and it went to this shallow area of a seamount and it spent the rest of the time we tagged it over there. This other bird, on the other hand, HPU, because we got money from HPU, so we gave names for different birds. This guy took off, went up here to this, this lighter color seamount area, looped back down, came back up, and ended up in the Aleutians and spent a long time that summer up there in the Aleutians. I'm just highlighting some of the really fun ones. This guy left home, went west, and went off Tokyo Bay, and it was hanging out in this, again, looks kind of just like the picture from the West Coast at the very place where the shelf drops off into the deep waters. Spent pretty much all summer just going back and forward over there. And this one was one of our most, the birds with the most personality. Again, he left Kure, went straight north, ran into the Aleutians, followed the Aleutians, then came over into Canada, came back down, and eventually we stopped talking to the bird when it was entering Washington State, coming into another shallow shelf with deep canyon area that's known for being a high albatross area. So again, I want to highlight, the big dichotomy. You saw the same birds. Some of these tracks had the same birds. Small trips to feed the chicks. When they're done, they go for it. They're free and they just really fill in space. And every bird did something different. So some of our findings, again, now when we look at the 7 birds that dispersed, there's more birds than dispersed than birds that we only had loops, because these are birds that had loops and left, or left directly without feeding the chicks. The story is very similar. They're spending about 60% of the time in no man's land, in the open ocean. And they did enter other countries' EEZs. Okay, so now the final part, I want to give you a little more information about what's been happening the last couple years. This is now using new technology, using GPS tags, which are really light. They don't have an antenna, and they actually allow us to get really, really fine locations. We can get locations every 15 minutes, 30 minutes, always on the clock. Really, really nice. And they give us information about also how the birds, the pitch and yaw and so forth of the birds. So here, Michelle Hester, who's sitting back there, you can ask her some questions if you like, is programming a tag with this, looks like this 1980s cell phone. But it's actually, she's not talking to the bird, she's programming the tag. And here you see a bird with the tag and a handkerchief over the head so they stay calm, being tagged on curing. So the goal for this was to tag 20 birds with GPS tags in 2 years, 10 and 10, when they had chicks. And none of this would have been possible without the really hard work of the Cure crew from the state. You may know some of these guys, Matt, Naomi, Nims were essential, really leading the other volunteers running this, and really, really hard work. So this is where the work took place in Cure, the most remote of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. This is what it looks like. So, there's a lot of, these are Nixon albatrosses. The blackfoots are more on the beach, but, there's a lot of albatrosses. There's maybe about 4,000 pairs, I think, to choose from. This is kind of the living arrangements. And the key thing I wanted to show you is that with these tags, the wonderful thing is these tags don't use the satellites. These tags send the data via radio. So there is somewhere, it's hard to see, but there's a little VHF antenna on top of the hut. And the birds go out to sea, come back down. We download the data, and we really need the birds to download the data, because once they leave, if they haven't downloaded, those data will never be retrieved again. So we only handle the bird one time when we put the tag, and then they do their thing, and the tag will eventually fall off when the tape wears off. This is, here you see a black-footed albatross with the tag, no antenna, really tiny, smaller footprint, really very small, hard to see sometimes. And this is the chick. The nice thing about working on a colony is we can actually follow how the chick is doing. Are the chicks gaining mass? Are they alive? Are they not alive? Get a little more information of how things are going. Of course, there's also the other partner. We only tag one bird, but at least we get some information of how things are developing. To keep track of the chick, the crew team, they use marine debris to mark the nests, and then, to put visible buoys with numbers next to the nest and so forth. And then the chick gets a tiny little piece of Tessa tape, this cloth tape that we use to put the tags on the birds, on in some feathers on the back of the head so we can make sure we can follow the bird. They're too small to have bands at this point. Later they get bands, but right now there's no bands that we can put on. You know, the chicks grow and they're fed and they grow right from January all the way to June. The crew goes out and they weigh the chicks periodically, and we have control birds so we can make sure that handling the parents does not affect in any way the growth of the chicks. So we have the ability to do that. So this is more the Blackfoot albatross habitat you see on the beach. You know, there's this sort of pits, this kind of nest bowls, and the chicks are sort of in their little pits. And you know, this guy is getting weighed in the bucket.
That one that looks kind of light colored, that's still a black-footed?
Yes, all of these guys, I think the light ones, like this is a chick, you see is all fluffy, downy, and another chick. Yeah, and these guys look like adults. I think that looks like a Laysan albatross from here. Yeah, that's a Laysan albatross. You see the white head.
Did she not use due care looking at her thumb?
I don't know. Good point. Maybe, you know, it's very likely. Yeah, it's very, I see that. I'm not sure the details of that, but yeah, something like that. Sounds very plausible. You know, eventually the chick gets really big. This is a chick trying to pretend, I'm so little, I'm so hungry, feed me. And it's like, no, you're heavier than I am by now. But, you know, okay, one more food delivery. You see the metal band there, you know. And what did these birds do? Well, I'm going to show you some more sort of spaghetti lines. You know, we're crunching through loads and loads of data, but I just want to give you some of the key things we're finding. So what we're finding is that when you look at a bunch of different loops, again, right, everybody's leaving Cure, making a loop and coming home, making a loop and coming home. From February and March, the early part of the breeding season, all the birds are on top of each other. Everybody's doing the same, very stereotypical pattern. They're coming up and foraging along the Emperor Seamountain chain, which is this line that runs like that. They're really targeting some of these seamounts and coming home. A lot of voyages, just really small, you know, about 300-400 kilometers away. Later in April, the chicks need more food. You know, they can be left alone for longer, and now they start, the same loops now become really long loops. So this now is progressive loops from the same bird, and the loops go longer. There's one like this, and then they start getting longer, and some of the loops go all the way to the shelf in Japan. So some of the birds are using these high productive shelf areas. Again, between April and May, the loops get longer and longer and longer. At the end of the day, when you take all the data from the 2 years, from February to May, 10 birds and 10 birds, this is what it looks like. They really fill in the North Pacific, but really on the west. None of these birds are coming to California. They're not even coming down towards the main Hawaiian Islands. They're really staying over there and really using this northwestern part with a lot of the seamounts. And again, like always, you know, remember some birds have personality. Some birds have personality here too. There's a couple birds that didn't read the memo and went a different path, you know. So now our next step is taking all of these data and really distilling it into some of these range maps and really relating it to the underlying oceanography. So at the end of the day, then what are some of the lessons that we've learned? Well, I think it's safe to say that black-footed albatrosses range very widely. They go very far, both during the breeding season, January to June, and during the summer non-breeding season. We saw different examples in different places, and they really go. They're oceanic birds. It's really fascinating when you think, you know, that these Hawaiian albatrosses are breeding in the middle of a very unproductive part of the ocean, right, in the subtropical gyre. So we're stuck here in Hawaii, and they have this strategy which entails going far and looking for the productive places in the ocean that can be thousands of kilometers away. So this is basically their strategy. They fly over the unproductive parts and they seek either seamounts that are very localized areas of productivity, or they go to the shelves on either side. We saw examples of that. In doing so, they leave our waters. And when they're tagged in U.S. mainland waters, West Coast waters, they also leave those areas, and they really range far and into international waters. On average, we saw about 60% of the time is spent in the high seas. The high seas is a legal term that means that these waters do not belong to any country. They are the far west, okay, open. Okay. In these areas, we know there's things like pirate fishing, where any mitigation measure that tries to avoid seabird bycatch or incidental mortality is not really applied. You know, there's no rules. These people are really profit-driven, and there's really very little interest or in following any of these rules. Also, we know some of these places have really high marine debris areas, and indirectly, we know it really seems this northwestern Pacific is really a happening place for the plastic, because again, the Kure birds that forage on that side are really showing the highest levels of plastic. So far today, every albatross chick we have looked at, either dead via necropsy or looking at the boluses, everyone from 2008 to 2012 has had some plastic. So this is really a pervasive phenomenon. In particular, the ones that are foraging, again, from curing the Western North Pacific have the highest levels, the highest we've ever seen for any other bird published in the literature. To give you an example, on average, about 70% of the stomach volume or 65% of the weight of the material found in the stomach is plastic. So this is very, very substantial. If you scale it up based on their weight, our weight, the weight of the plastic they have, and then what would be comparable to us, this is similar to one of us carrying about 75 bottle caps in our stomach. So huge amounts. And there's people, I have some students looking into some of these issues to see whether chicks grow more slowly when they have more plastic, or they have worse condition, those kinds of things. But even if we don't have the evidence, it really, it's something to think about. Definitely something to think about and to be very concerned about. Because again, the loads of plastic are really, really insane.
That's a great picture.
So what can you do? I don't want to leave you all bummed, on this nice Sunday afternoon. So I think, what can we do? We can all, spread the word, think about where our waste goes, try to use less and use plastic wisely, because it's a very precious material, but it's very long-lived, and in the ocean, it can end up eventually in the stomach of an albatross. So in collaboration with our colleagues, we have made some educational materials, so maybe you can check them out, or if you're a teacher, use some of these things. We have bolus dissection, photographs of boluses where students look through this material and interpret and look at the tracking data in conjunction with all of that. So it's really a great way to draw attention and also promote stewardship for the ocean and these birds. And that's all I have. So now I can answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much. Yes.
Are there similar studies done like this for the Laysan albatross, and would they show the same thing?
Yeah, so let's see. There's been tracking studies for the Laysan albatross done at Kure with other different technology called geolocation, which gives you much longer records, but they're not as detailed spatially. Currently, actually, there is tagging of Laysan albatrosses here on our island in Kaena Point, part of the same project led by USGS, to understand how they use the ocean, especially when they come in and out of the islands, so we can map highways where maybe things like floating windmills would not be a good idea, for example. So there's some work like that happening.
So you don't think there's a difference then between white and black?
Oh, there is a big difference.
That's what
yes.
My question was.
Okay, there is massive difference. On Turn Island, where both were tagged together, early on they use the same pieces of the ocean. As soon as March rolls around, they separate. Okay. The Laysans go up to the Aleutians, and they're feeding a lot on squid.
And the black goes toward Japan.
And the blacks come, to California. So it completely separates out. Okay. Yeah, and in Midway also, the program TOP, the Tagging of Pacific Pelagics, has shown separation of both species. Yeah, so we know for many reasons, like the chemistry of their tissues, what they eat. Many pieces of evidence suggest the two species separate out in the ocean.
So they managed to share in the Northwest, but as soon as they're on their own and they don't have to take care of the chicks, they
Yes.
separate.
They separate. Also, there's a little separation in time because the Laysan albatross chicks are hatched about a week to 10 days on average later. So things happen a little later. So even though the maps you say, oh, they use the same space, but there's an offset in time. So by the time the Laysans are starting to feed their chicks, the Blackfoots are kind of starting to go a little further already. So there's a bit of a separation even in time. Yeah. And Laysan albatrosses, they eat a lot of plastic too. I don't want you to think
no,
they
I
do
know
not,
that.
because they do.
I notice on Midway, if you're inland, the concentration of Laysan is almost exclusively Laysan with maybe 1, 2 Blackfoot. You get out into the sand and the edge of the island, it's almost all black.
Okay, yeah. The thing is, their abundances are very different. So the Laysan albatrosses, there's maybe 1.3, I've heard different numbers, but over 1 million birds, okay? Blackfoot albatrosses, there's maybe about up to 300,000. So the numbers are very different. And Blackfoot albatrosses, also when you look at the pollution levels, they have much higher pollution levels of mercury and lead and POPs, persistent organochlorinated compounds and stuff. So that's why a lot of interest is focusing on the Blackfoots. Also, Blackfoots breed more on the beaches, and if sea level rise happens, to the extent that we think, they're going to be the ones that maybe taking the bigger hit. So I think that's why there's a lot more interest right now in really trying to understand where they go and how they make a living. Yeah.
Question now I think I can identify a black-footed
Okay.
albatross because I usually see the lace on this. I wanted to ask you, about 35 years ago, I was on Midway. I don't think I ever saw a Blackfoot on Midway. Do you know if they had at that time 35 years ago? Or Midway?
Yeah, I think
Before his time.
Yeah, but I think they were there. Yeah, I imagine.
But anyway, one more important question is, when the black-footed albatross takes off and ranges for food, assuming he doesn't encounter a fishing vessel area, what's his typical, what is he trying to do and how does he get his food when he's searching?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is really a deep question, right? Because, we have different hypotheses. I think the prevailing idea right now is that they're using many different senses and some are redundant, which means they give you the same kind of information. For example, people put magnets on the heads of albatrosses and they see, well, if they use the magnetic field, they're going to be completely confused. They may never come back home. No, the bird comes back home, just fine. They mess with their sense of smell. Maybe they, when they're close to the islands, they can smell the island, or when they're in productive areas, they can smell the phytoplankton, and that's how they find food. The birds go and come back just fine. So it seems that, there is, I'm sure, some hierarchy of rules. Like when you go to the market, how do we go to the market? Well, we get in the car, we drive to the shopping center, then we park, then we orient ourselves, we walk to the shopping center, then you look for the aisle number, then you look for the color of the thing you want to buy in the aisle number. So maybe they're doing something comparable, where maybe, if you're in the main Hawaiian Islands, the first rule is, well, fly north. If I'm going to California or to Alaska, fly north. Keep flying north until the water gets cold, or the water smells like phytoplankton, or the water turns green. If that happens, then, okay, you're in the shopping center. Now you got to find the next thing. What's the next thing? Oh, look for a fishing boat, or look for other birds, or, but I'm sure there's different rules that are being used, and maybe olfaction may be really important at the end to find the actual dead squid or piece of food. But from Hawaii, there's no way you can smell the squid that's in Alaska. So maybe, you're using other rules to go down and find the food. And then you gotta go home.
But I mean, do they,
yeah.
do they somehow detect the fish in the water and catch it, or that's what I'm kind of.
Oh, that's what you mean? Okay. So, well, smell is really big for all of these tube-nosed birds, they're called. You put food smells and they come to the boat. So olfaction is really important. Also visual, big visual predators. Like we know that when there's no moon, they don't fly as far. In nights of full moon, they fly more and they cover more ground. So it really suggests they're looking for food, smelling for food, looking for visual cues, foam lines, places like fronts. And that's why maybe marine debris can be such a attraction for them, because they're looking for contrast, for features. You're flying through the deep blue ocean and then you see a line of foam and a bunch of stuff. Most of the time, that was a good place because there's flying fish eggs, there's, dead squid, things like that you can eat. Now there's plastic too. But we don't really know, right? We would have to be a bird to really, really know. Yes. Go ahead.
Everything's at the surface though, not diving. Everything's at the surface.
Yeah, everything's at the surface. I should have said that.
Surface.
Yeah,
Searching.
with their big wings, and they're wonderful, majestic flyers, but they're fairly clumsy as far as seabirds go. They cannot fly and really pick stuff up like a frigate bird.
Yeah.
They they land and then they'll paddle around and then they'll gobble up some amazing huge piece of food. Yeah.
Do they have to sleep?
Yeah, well, this is, another big question. Again, some of these birds, they'll go 24 days to the sea. The young will go 4 to 6 years in the ocean without coming back to land. So sometimes in the ocean, you see them sleeping. Yeah, floating, with their little bill like that, floating around, So they definitely sleep. Some people say, can they do something like dolphins where they shut half of their brain off and sleep with half their brain, and then we don't really know. We can put dolphins in a tank and study it. Nobody has succeeded putting albatrosses in a tank and having them fly and sleep at the same time. But definitely, you see them sometimes sleeping at the surface in the early morning, or if it's really foggy, things like that. They just hang out and sleep. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked about they go a lot to other countries, international waters. Do you work with those countries? And what are you doing to improve?
Yeah. So what we do is really nice. We have a nice kind of collaboration with an NGO called BirdLife International. BirdLife International works in many countries. They have national representative groups that speak on their behalf. So BirdLife has been very smart, because what they've done is they got all the bird scientists together to share the data, which is pretty big success, because we all want our data to publish it. But we all shared it, we put it together in one big database. The BirdLife International scientists, we all agreed how we're going to analyze it, because we never can agree, but we came up with a plan to make it all the same. The BirdLife scientists analyzed the data and they made maps. And then they went to the fishing, it's called regional fishery management organizations. Like for us, we have Westpac is our similar entity for our part of the ocean. And they gave presentations and they shared maps and they said, well, you guys are responsible for this bird, this bird, this bird at this time of the year, and this is where they go and this is where you fish. So by providing that information, then those RFMOs, that is where the countries come together, they can say, oh, wow, well, we should do something. We should keep track of how many birds we kill, what kind, what sex, what age. We should put in mitigation measures so we don't kill the birds, especially in areas that we know from the maps are hot areas of bird activity. So this is all great, but they could say, no, it's so expensive. We don't want to spend the energy. So then BirdLife talks to other people and then says, we went to see the RFMOs and they did not listen to us. And this is a report of how good the RFMOs are doing things to protect birds. And that goes to consumers who buy the fish. So now you give the RFMO the tools to be a good for the birds, the knowledge of where the birds go, and then you keep track of what they do and you give that to the consumers. So now you can say this RFMO knew this bird was in the area and they have chosen to not do anything to protect these birds. They don't even keep track of how many are killed. That's really bad. However, this other RFMO, they have implemented observer programs and mitigation measures, and they're really forthcoming, and they collect the birds so we can understand who's killed, where and how, and the age and the sex. They are trying to be good. And then the consumer, hopefully, if they know about the problem, they can vote with the wallet. You see, so this is kind of the big plan, carrot and stick sort of. And it's been working really, I think it's been working really nicely to bring some countries that traditionally have been not very forthcoming about information or very suspicious of the intentions of, say, the US government or NOAA to actually share information, like Japan and Korea and Taiwan have actually, there's been some papers where they said, well, here's our fishing data. Now you guys look at it. So I think there's a lot of progress. The illegal fishing, that's a big problem because those people don't follow any rules and they cannot be reined in. So that's a much bigger problem. Yeah.
Isn't the far more serious problem plastic?
Well, that's another really big question that's really unresolved. And I think it's very hard because morally, we all agree it's a terrible thing. But being able to demonstrate that a bird died by eating X amount of plastic is very, very hard. Because
you have a dead bird hanging on a hook, it's pretty obvious.
It's pretty obvious,
okay.
That's right. Also, if you think about it, especially those of you who've been to Midway, I mean, how many chicks die for the most silly reason? They get hit by a golf cart or there's the tsunami comes and wipes all these, chicks. Chicks die for many reasons in huge amounts, but adults, once you have adult birds, their survivorship is 99.9%. They just do not die unless there's something like fishing. So for the population, killing adults can have a huge effect compared with the chicks. So this is that said, I mean, if you had something that you care about, you often get a insurance policy. And right now, if you tell people every albatross chick has plastic, and we know some of this plastic has noxious chemicals, and these albatrosses have huge amounts of noxious chemicals in their tissues. Well, I mean, can we get an insurance policy? Should we try to do something about it? Just in case, right? Just in case. I think we should. We can't wait for the population to be, the reproduction to be crashing, those bad things to happen because it may be too late. So right now, fishing, I think, we have more evidence that it's really bad for the populations, but there's the gorilla on the room of the plastic and the pollution associated with that. Right?
Okay.
Sorry, a long answer.
Let's close the formal part of the talk, and you can save your more questions until after we conclude the formal session. But thank you
Cool.
so much.
Thank you. Great.
And remember to come up and see those tags. Next week, we're learning about humpback whale